So welcome to this webinar on the problems with private prisons, sponsored by the Prison Reform Task Force of the Desert Southwest Conference. I'm Paul Bullis, Chair of the Prison Reform Task Force. The presenters this evening are with the nonprofit organization Abolish Private Prisons. They are both attorneys and work full-time for the organization. John Dacey is the executive director and co-founder of Abolish Private Prisons. John worked for 12 years at legal aid and public interest law firms, where he handled class actions and other cases for the poor and people with disabilities in matters concerning poverty and disability programs, particularly Medicaid and jail conditions. John was also in private practice in Phoenix for almost 30 years, where he represented provider organizations, particularly nonprofits, in Arizona's Medicaid program. Robert Craig is the Associate Director of Abolish Private Prisons. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 2012. He clerked for Judge Andy Hurwitz on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for 1 year, followed by a 3-year clerkship with Judge James Soto of the District Court of Arizona. He volunteered with Abolish Private Prisons over the fall of 2017 and joined the team full-time in 2018. Robert has also taught 5th grade in Phoenix for 2 years as part of Teach for America and worked with underserved communities while attending law school. Here is the contact information for Abolish Private Prisons and for John and Robert. If you remember abolishprivateprisons.org, you'll be able to find everybody you need, and also put the slide up, back up at the end of today's presentation. Now, John and Robert will go into a lot more detail in their presentation, but I want to give just a very brief introduction to private prisons. First of all, what is a private prison? Well, basically, it's when the government turns over operations of a prison to a private for-profit corporation. The private corporation owns or leases the facility, and the government then has a contract with the private corporation and usually pays a certain amount of money per inmate per day. The contracts often guarantee that the government will pay for a minimum number of inmates per day, whether or not the private prison actually has that many inmates. There are many problems with private for-profit companies making money off of the caging and punishment of inmates that Robert and John will discuss. One of the big problems is that because they are for-profit companies, private prisons are beholden to their owners and shareholders rather than to the people of the United States or Arizona or wherever else they have their prison. In fact, private prisons explicitly warn their shareholders that sentencing reform and immigration reform may affect their earnings. More inmates with longer sentences is good for business. Fewer inmates with shorter sentences is bad for business. Private prisons can therefore be a roadblock to justice reform, which seeks to lower the huge number of prison inmates in this country and to reduce some of the extremely long sentences, especially for nonviolent crimes. Private prisons are a matter of concern to people of faith throughout the United States. The United Methodist Church officially opposes private prisons, as you can see from this resolution from the United Methodist Church Book of Resolutions. In fact, the church's resolution says that we must oppose policies and practices that show greater allegiance to profit motive than to public safety and restorative justice. Many other denominations have adopted similar resolutions opposing private prisons. The United Methodist Church's pension fund has also divested any investments in private prison companies. Letters from different faiths throughout Arizona, including United Methodist pastors, have also joined together in an ecumenical statement opposing private prisons, once again showing that private prisons are of concern to people of all faiths. We thank the Arizona Faith Network for being a strong voice against private prisons. John and Robert have taken concrete steps to try to abolish private prisons. They recently filed a lawsuit against the director of Arizona's Department of Corrections, asking the court to rule that private prisons are unconstitutional. As part of their presentation tonight, John and Robert will talk about their lawsuit and why private prisons are unconstitutional. They will also tell us things that we can do to help abolish private prisons. Now, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions this evening. If you have any questions for John or Robert, please type them into the chat section in Zoom. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please type your questions in the comment section. We'll ask John and Robert to respond to your questions at the end of their presentation, or questions may come up in the middle of the presentation that they'll respond to as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to John and Robert.
This is John Dacey, the Executive Director of Abolish Private Prisons. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about this topic of public interest. Abolish Private Prisons is an Arizona nonprofit corporation. We are a tax-exempt 501c3 that was established in Arizona in June of 2015. We chose the name quite deliberately, using the verb abolish in order to harken back to the pre-Civil War abolition movement. Our mission broadly includes criminal justice reform, but job one for us is our litigation challenge to the existence of private for-profit prisons. To be quite certain, our lawsuit, which Robbie will talk about further in just a moment, is not a comparative case. We're not saying public prisons are better than private prisons for purposes of this lawsuit. Public prisons, of course, have their own problems. What we're saying is that the United States Constitution does not allow the government to turn over the incarceration function to private business. These are private for-profit businesses. They are an institutional model. So if you think of businesses like hospitals, hotels, nursing homes, the model only works when you have high capacity. And these are also businesses that, like any private business, wants to make a profit and grow the size of the pie. Well, this isn't like building a road or managing a hospital. We're talking about taking away people's individual liberty in the most fundamental way. And we think it is a perverse incentive to make money by incarcerating more and more people for longer periods of time, and for wanting people to come back after they've re-entered the community. And most people who are in prisons will re-enter their communities, so we should have every reason to hope that their re-entry will be successful. But the private for-profit model is in contrast to the public interest, which is to see success and reduce taxpayer spending. In the private model, the incentive is, like any business, repeat customers. So let's just talk for a few minutes about what private prisons are and what they are not. So Paul gave a description of private prisons as the circumstance where the government turns over operational control of a prison to a private contractor. And so let me be quite clear that what we are not talking about here are the many other circumstances where large corporations are making lots of money off of mass incarceration. And to be quite clear about that, most people who are in prisons are in public facilities. But with regard to the private sector, I'm sorry, let me go back. With regard to who makes money off of having lots of people in prisons, it's not just the private prison industry. There are large vendors that make lots of money off of food service, medical care, providing linens, communication services, transportation, construction and maintenance, many other kinds of services where there is an incentive to make a lot of money off of mass incarceration generally. Our focus right now is on the narrower circumstance where the operation of a prison, the incarceration function itself, is turned over to a private contractor. In Arizona, I believe we have 12 private prisons, and they fall into three general categories. Number one, they contract with the Arizona Department of Corrections, Rehabilitation, and Reentry, formerly called the Arizona Department of Corrections. There are 6 facilities under contract right now with the Arizona Department of Corrections that take Arizona state prisoners after conviction of crimes. There are facilities in Arizona, privately operated, that take prisoners and pretrial detainees from the federal government, several different federal agencies, including, for example, the United States Marshal Service, Department of Homeland Security, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which would be the immigration detainees on the civil side. Third, we have private prisons in Arizona that take state prisoners from other states. And what states contract with prisons in this state has varied over time, including Hawaii, Alaska, Vermont, Nevada, California, Kansas, for example. And basically the market, if you will, for prisoners in private facilities is pretty much controlled by 3 private prison corporations, all of which contract in Arizona. So the 2 giants, if you will, the publicly traded corporations, CoreCivic, which used to be known as Corrections Corporation of America until it rebranded in 2017, is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange and is based in Nashville, Tennessee. The Geo Group out of Boca Raton, Florida, is also publicly traded. And they both have facilities under contract, not just with the state of Arizona, but with other government agencies, including the city of Mesa for part of its jail services. And third, there is the privately held corporation, Management and Training Corporation out of Salt Lake, Utah, that also has a contract with a facility in Marana at this point in time. So as I mentioned, about 90% of all prisoners nationally are in public facilities. But the percentage of state prisoners that are in private facilities vary greatly from state to state. So as an example, Arizona is not just one of the top 5 states in terms of our incarceration rate generally. We're also one of the top 5 states regarding the use of private prison contractors. Approximately 20% of Arizona prisoners, or approximately 8,000 people on any given day, are in private prisons in Arizona. On the other hand, when you get into immigration detainees, the civil detention, about 70% of immigrant detainees are in private prisons as well. So when you have an incentive with your vendor to stay in business, to make money, to increase the size of your business, how do you go about that? Well, one way is you spend a lot of money at the state legislature and the Capitol and other states and Capitol Hill and the like to make sure that your interests are served. And what can possibly go wrong with such a circumstance? Rob, if you would, maybe talk about some of the things that we think have gone wrong that are exemplars of what can happen with a private incarceration system.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I wanted to say thanks, Paul. That's got to be one of the best introductions that lays out the issues that wasn't done by somebody that's, associated with abolished private prison. So thank you. That was great. As John mentioned, one of the things that we get asked is, okay, so in theory, it makes sense what you're talking about. There's this perverse incentive to increase the size of the pie, the amount of people that are in prison, and keep people in for longer. And sort of these economic theories make sense, but does that actually play out in real life? And there's some pretty clear examples of how that actually does happen. About 10 years ago now, it's crazy that it's been that long, this story got quite a bit of national attention. It's got called Kids for Cash. And essentially what was going on is that there was a couple of juvenile judges in Pennsylvania that were sending kids to a juvenile detention facility at a significantly higher rate than all the other judges that were sitting in the same court. And it came out that what happened is that they were getting a kickback from the people that were running the facility. Now, when this story was, sort of grabbing everybody's mind share back in 2010, 2011, the idea of private prisons hadn't even really caught on yet. A lot of people didn't know they existed. If they knew that they existed, people didn't realize how widespread they were. But if you think about it, that kind of incentive only exists when there is that financial incentive for the prison operator. So when you dig into the details, what happened was that there was somebody who got a group of investors together to make this juvenile detention facility on the understanding that they were going to be able to convince the juvenile judges to send a bunch of kids there that otherwise wouldn't have been, right? And so this money circle is necessary to that kind of corruption. It's just sort of another avenue for corruption. And of course, the tragic story that came out of Kids for Cash that really skyrocketed it to national headlines was that a concerned parent called some of the local law enforcement and said, my child is getting involved in some things, maybe drugs, and I just like to scare him a little bit to, show him what the consequences are. And so the police came, and that kid got, unfortunately, in front of one of these judges that was part of the kickback scheme, and sent the child to this privately run detention center, and that kid ended up committing suicide. And it was all for just a small amount of personal drugs that never should have gotten to what it was now. That outcome should just never have happened. So that's one of the things that sort of initially, if people were paying super close attention, that was one of the initial indicators that there was this additional avenue of corruption that people should look out for. A slightly different way that you see the financial incentive in play here is this the story about the spouse of a federal judge who invested in private prisons right around the time when the federal judge was overseeing or giving her okay to one of the largest immigration raids, right? And it's this sophisticated way that people who have power, who have money, are taking advantage of people through the stock market. And it just shows you that when there's a financial incentive involved, you're going to get the gamut of sophistication of corruption levels. Everything from the direct bribery that the Kids for Cash scandal pulled out to this more sophisticated sort of almost insider trading thing that this story revealed. The other thing that happened that both Paul and John mentioned is that the people who run private prisons have a lot of money. And one of the things that they do with this money is that they work at the state level in particular to pass laws to make sure that they're going to continue to have people that the state pays for the beds for, and to increase the amount of people. NPR did this investigation also back in 2010 that showed that SB 1070, which if you were in Arizona at the time was a really big deal. It turned out to be sort of an arrest people with brown skin law, largely overturned by the Supreme Court a couple years after that. But what turned out had happened in this investigation was that the private prison companies through ALEC, this state legislative council, was helping to draft and influence the language that eventually got into Senate Bill 1070. And so you have the industry that's looking to benefit also on the front side, helping to write the laws that are going to, keep the people flowing. And of particular note is that this goes against what they say in public. All of the companies take a public stance that they don't lobby and they don't participate in criminal justice reform. But when people dig into it, it shows that what they're publicly saying is not actually what's happening on the ground. And this is a Washington Post story, how for-profit prisons, and again, this was before the private prison industry had taken up so much mindshare. They were spending a ton of money, not just directly influencing legislation through ALEC, but also through campaign contributions and contributions to people. And it started out, it was very bipartisan. They were donating to largely Democrats and Republicans all over the country in different states. And as you would expect, many of those donations were going to states that had large prison populations: Texas, Florida, Tennessee. That's changed recently, and the private prison industry is now donating largely to Republican candidates as it has become sort of a politicized issue. But that's a very recent development in terms of how the industry is spending its money. And just to show you that, this public statement about what they say that they're doing, not getting involved, this is from an annual report that the publicly traded companies are required to file with the SEC. And they said, and this is from 2010, but it gets filed every year in their annual reports, that the demand for our facilities and services could be negatively affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, relaxation of parole standards and stuff, and decriminalization of certain activities. So they're acutely aware that their business model relies on the fact that we incarcerate so many people in the United States. And, you can tell how they're spending their money to make that happen. As Paul mentioned, we filed our lawsuit June 15th of this year. The state of Arizona filed a motion to dismiss, saying that essentially that the claims that we're making in the lawsuit, there's no legal basis for them. And at this point, Abolish Private Prisons is working with a group of volunteer lawyers to respond to that motion in our opposition brief. The deadline for that brief is Monday. And as soon as we file that with the court, you'll be able to find all of these documents on our website. If you go to the website at the top, there's a banner that says latest updates on the case. To find it, right now we just have the complaint. As soon as we file our opposition, we'll get their motion and our opposition also filed. And you can see sort of the arguments that the government's making and how we've responded to them. I'd like to turn it back to John now to talk sort of about the people who are supporting us and why we're focusing on this issue right now.
As you can see from the screen, there are a number of different organizations that call for abolition of private for-profit prisons, and the reasons vary from faith-based groups referring to theology, biblical, gospel reasons for doing so, to human dignity reasons as well. The Japanese American Citizens League, for example, it ties it to their experience with the internment camps during World War II as well. Let me talk, kind of move sideways for a moment and just talk a little bit about the contracts. So the Arizona Department of Corrections goes through public procurements to purchase the services of private prison vendors. And those contracts generally are for a period of 10 years, and the ones that I've seen, 10 years, and then they'll have 5-year, 2 5-year options for renewals. And there is usually a high occupancy guarantee. And what I mean by that is that, for example, when Arizona contracts with the GEO group, to operate the facility at about 35th Avenue and Cocopah in Phoenix. There's an occupancy guarantee where the state of Arizona, through the department, is guaranteeing to its vendor, we will guarantee you 90% occupancy or higher in order to enter into this contract with us. And the state, therefore, has a financial incentive to transfer prisoners to keep the beds full in the private prisons. In talking to various individual people incarcerated in those facilities, some of them have been upset with the way that transfer occurred, in that they were close to completing an educational program or a vocational program in the public facility, were transferred to the private facility, wanted to complete their programs only to learn those same programs were not being offered in the private facilities. That is going to be a spotty circumstance that's going to vary from one facility to the next and over different periods of time. But with the state giving that guarantee, you can imagine that public officials do not want to explain to taxpayers why they're paying for empty cells in private prisons. And so they're going to have that incentive to move people from public to private, or to place them in privates right away. Now, there are some differences between public and private that make it difficult to compare the cost of the service, the successfulness of the programs and services and the like. And fundamentally, one of them is that private prisons are not subject to the public records laws, such as the Freedom of Information Act or the Arizona Public Records Law, as the government agencies are. So that makes it difficult for the public to get information about those facilities and the services they're providing and when, and the successfulness and the like. The corporations that are providing these services, not just in Arizona, but in many states, these are multi-billion-dollar corporations. The public agencies across the country are paying these agencies as much as $3 billion a year in revenues to provide this service, and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars a year in profits from it. As Paul mentioned in his introductory message, the typical way that the private prisons get paid is through a per diem, a set daily rate for every day that a prisoner is in the private prison. And the corporations calculate those per diem rates into how much is our cost and how much is our profit, and they will calculate. We on average will be making $21 a day for every day this person is in our cell. And so they have a incentive to get people there and to keep them there and to not release them. I'm not suggesting that the prisons decide when a person gets released, but they can certainly influence it.
John, 1 second. I just jump in really quickly. When we talk about per diems, whitewash this is a little bit about how, that actually see it. If you look through their financial documents, they talk about it in terms of a compensated man day. And that is how they reduce people in prison to the assets on a balance sheet. They don't call it a per diem. They don't call it, this person that they refer to it. They talk about a person's life in their care inside of a prison as a compensated man day. I just think that's emblematic of how these corporations reduce the humanity and the dignity of people to a line on a balance sheet. It's the kind of thing that you would expect to read, about a ton of steel or something like that that's being traded on the commodities market, not about how you would expect to read about, somebody that's in your care.
Keep in mind that a per diem rate sets the maximum payment that the facility is going to get to take care of a person. And so if you think about the for-profit business model generally in any kind of business, how do you increase your profits? Well, you increase your rates and you decrease your costs. Well, if you're being paid a flat per diem rate each day, your profit is going to come from the differential between the cost to run the facility and the rate. And the way you increase the profit in terms of the structure is by reducing your costs inside the prison. That can be paying your staff very little. It can be having less staff than you perhaps should have. It can mean cutting services or doing without services. And anecdotally, I have talked to a number of inmates who have complained about the absence of programs that they need to qualify for earlier release from their prison term. And you can tie that directly to a profit motive. So that is something.
Here too,
go
John.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry. If that kind of thing is interesting to you, Shane Bauer wrote an amazing book called American Prison. And what he did is he applied and got a job at a private prison and recounts sort of the horror stories of being a guard in these places, specifically because of the complete lack of training and understaffing. And it gives you a perspective on, what a guard is seeing, because it's not just the people that are in prison that suffer the consequences of understaffing. It's also the people that are working there, who don't have enough support to keep it safe for everybody inside. So it's a fascinating book. It's very well written. It's also published on Mother John's website as a shorter version, but it's very interesting if that perspective is interesting to you.
Robert, what's the name of that book again?
I think it's American Prison by Shane Bauer.
Thank you. And Jack, can I just jump in with a couple of questions that we've received that are kind of relevant to some of the topics you've been discussing? And one person had a question about the contracts with private prisons. And the question is, do private prisons have a minimum occupancy clause in their contracts?
Yeah, that's going to vary from one contract to the next and the negotiating positions of the parties to the contract. But the contracts we've looked at with the Department of Corrections in Arizona do have occupancy guarantees, 90% and up. That's not always going to be the case, because there are circumstances such as, now this is anecdotal, I haven't reviewed this contract yet, but when Kansas decided in 2019 to start sending some prisoners to private prisons in Arizona, that's not going to be, I don't think, a regular full service contract, if you will, with a guaranteed flow. So my guess is that, as in any contractual situation, there are going to be different kinds of terms, but the ones we've seen have occupancy guarantees and long terms.
You also talked about a number of the private prison companies, some of which are publicly traded. And we received a question that in Yuma, the ICE detention facility is operated by LaSalle. And the question is this one of the publicly traded corporations?
I think LaSalle may be out of Louisiana, and they're not one of the public prisons here under contract with the Arizona Department of Corrections. So I have not looked at LaSalle, either their contract or taken a hard look at the company itself. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. You also talked a little bit about some of the lobbying that private prisons have done. And the question is, how do we find out which legislators have received money from GO and Core Civic and MTC?
Well, one of the things you can do is I think, go to the Arizona Secretary of State's office, and the elected officials do have to submit their financial statements annually that reports their donations. There may be donations from the entities themselves. Some of the things I've seen have been donations from the executives of the corporations as well. You know,
just to jump in real fast, the other place you can go is opensecrets.org. They're a nonprofit that operates a website that tracks much of the donations, and you can search by legislator. You can also search by the donor. So that's a good place to do it. But as John mentioned, it's somewhat hard to track this stuff because it can come directly from the organization or board members and stuff like that. So it can take a bit of investigation at different places, but the Secretary of State websites and Open Secrets, I think, are the two. Open Secrets is a really good website to see. You can look at an individual legislator and you can see all of the people that they're receiving large donations from, and you can also do it the other way.
Great, thank you. Someone else asked, why did the states start doing this? What's the reason they give? And I assume this being contracting with private prisons.
Let me go backwards on that one, excuse me, and go a little bit further back into the past. So if you look at a graph, I think you had a graph, Paul, of our prison populations over the decades. And I don't know if you're able to pull that particular graph up. It would be helpful if you can. But the point I wish to make from it is this. We went off the rails as a country in terms of the numbers and percentages of our people that we incarcerate, starting a little bit before 1980. Before then, yeah, there you go. So what we were looking at is a fairly even trend in terms of the number of people we incarcerate up until 1980. And so what you have here is we go from about 450 to 500,000 people total across the entire country in prisons and jails in 1980 to about 2.3 million in 2015. And the rates, it's come down a little bit and gone back up. But that's a 450% jump in the percentage of our population or just the numbers of people we incarcerate. Our population didn't increase generally, anywhere near that number. What happened wasn't an increase in crime, but a serious change in our policies and our laws, what we criminalized and what kind of sentencing laws we had. And some of that came back to some national model legislation that trickled down to the states, such as truth in sentencing, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and life is your sentence. Those kinds of laws that came out of the American Legislative Exchange Council, they were supported by other groups as well. And the private prison industry was very involved in the legislative work of ALEC back in those days. So for the private prison industry to take the position today, we don't affect legislation, they also aren't seeking to get rid of laws that they had a hand in creating in the first instance. So the point I'm seeking to make here is that because we had this explosion of the number of people we incarcerated, our existing prison system became very overcrowded. And so instead of looking at our policies and coming up with alternatives to incarceration and looking at the drain on our public treasuries that such an explosion had to the expense of education and healthcare and mental health care and the like, we instead decided to go with the short-term solution, which is to buy more beds through the private industry, which was reborn in this country, oh, by the way, right around the time that we started to have this explosion in our prison and jail populations. And of those 2.3 million people in prisons and jails, you can multiply that number by another 2.5 times for the number of people that are currently on probation and parole, whose lives continue in this cycle of being involved with the criminal justice system. So as an example to why are private prisons in use, a perfect example is what happened in California. You had federal judges that were threatening the California Department of Corrections with contempt sanctions and orders to start releasing prisoners because their facilities were so overcrowded. So the short-term answer, let's buy some prison cells in Arizona's private prisons. So they started sending prisoners over here. Arizona, same thing. But another big piece of it is if you go back to the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1980, much of their pitch at the time was that whatever the government does, the private sector can do better. And they wanted to privatize many governmental functions. Well, let me be real clear about this. We're not suggesting that public-private partnerships are a bad thing or that making a profit is a bad thing. What we're focused on is when you're talking about taking away a person's liberty, that should not be part of the equation. Profit should not be part of the equation. It should all be about criminal justice policy. And so right around the year 2000, I'm maybe off on a few years, Arizona at first started sending prisoners to private prisons in other states. Then we started contracting with private prisons that were built in the state. I think 2002 might be the earliest contract that I've seen. So to the caller, I would say, why do we use private prisons? I think part of it is the movement toward privatization. Part of it may have been in other states, if not Arizona, the overcrowding problem. I think part of the sustaining reason for it is the incredible power this industry has politically. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but so convinced were some that private prisons would be a cost saver to Arizona taxpayers, that they mandated that there be a cost comparative study annually, comparing the cost of public versus private prisons. Well, first of all, it's not an apples to apples comparison to begin with. Private prisons don't take the toughest cases that the public prisons do, generally. And there are certain categories of prisoners involving high cost of healthcare that are excluded from their contract obligations as well. But putting that aside, the Arizona Auditor General was then tasked with doing the annual cost comparison. And its first published study in 2011 or 2012 concluded private prisons cost slightly more than public facilities, even with having the easier to manage prisoners. So what do you think the response of the legislature was to that? You would think if their complaint was the study wasn't conducted properly, you would refine it. Instead, the legislature did away with any further studies. The public doesn't get to know. And because these corporations are not subject to public records laws, the public doesn't get to know. Such is the power this industry has had in our state alone. So that's part of the backstory about what the contracts include and the power of this industry right here in Arizona. What I'd like to talk about now is the lawsuit itself. What is it,
John, real quick,
doing?
can I jump in? Just so the pitch is just like John said, we can do it cheaper, and it's not just Arizona that it turns out found out that it's probably not cheaper. Essentially, every single study that's been done across the country has found that private prisons are at least as expensive and probably slightly more expensive, with the exception of a few studies that were paid for by the private prison industry. So take that for what you will. And the other thing about it is if you're thinking about it from the stance of a state legislator and why would you get involved in this, one of the things that people could do, one of the last remaining things that people could do as an individual to say, I disagree with the way that things are going in criminal justice, is you could vote no on a bond issue to build local prisons, because that's the way that prisons used to be financed. Is the state would have to go to a municipality and say, pass this bond so we can finance it. People got fed up and said, I don't want to spend more tax money on building more prisons. And they started voting these things down. So how do you get around that? Well, instead of going directly to the people, go to the legislature and say, you don't have to do a big capital spend, just we will build a facility and you can pay us per diem. So it's a way to go, again, around the will of the people. It takes away this individual accountability that people have, and goes directly to this deal that gets coordinated between the private companies and the legislature. So I just wanted to throw that in there as like another reason that you see the legislator doing it from the state perspective, and that's the pitch that the private corporations can make to the legislature.
So we filed a lawsuit, and we represent, at this point, 5 individuals who are in private prisons in Arizona through the Arizona Department of Corrections, and we represent the Arizona State Conference of the NAACP. We filed the lawsuit against David Shin, the director of the Arizona Department of Corrections, because that's the way you have to do it in federal court. And Rob, if you wouldn't mind, just going through what the lawsuit is about. Whoops.
Yes. No, I got it. Sorry. So there's a few claims in the lawsuit, and I'll go through them individually. There's also one claim that's not in this lawsuit, but that will be in future lawsuits that we'd like to talk about. So the first claim is slavery, that holding somebody for profit violates the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist within the United States. So what we're saying here is, if you look at the fundamentals of what slavery is, what does it actually mean? A lot of people have in their head that the limitation of slavery, or sort of the narrow definition of slavery, is just what some people call African slavery or chattel slavery. And it's the kind of thing that you think about, you learn about in history class. And it is a type of slavery, and a particularly awful type of slavery, but it's not the only type of slavery. If you look into how people think about slavery, it's actually broader than that. And one of the common denominators when it talks about slavery is the reduction of a person to a piece of property, and that property interest being traded and sold among other people. Essentially, it's a commodification of an individual. And so we say that the 13th Amendment says you can't have slavery in the United States no matter what. A lot of people point to the punishment clause, which you see on your screen, that says, except as punishment for a crime. And there was a popular documentary called 13th, and the conclusion was, look, that except as punishment for a crime language means that we can have slavery in the United States. We think that's actually wrong in terms of how you interpret the text of the Constitution. We think that the punishment clause only applies to involuntary servitude. So, and it's not just us, by the way, that thinks this. Justice Harlan, who's a famous Supreme Court justice, he wrote in the dissent of an opinion that had to do with some strange maritime labor laws. The facts are not particularly important, but at the time when he was writing and thinking about what the 13th Amendment meant, he said that slavery was the passage of the 13th Amendment, that slavery could not exist in the United States, and then went on to separately address involuntary servitude and said that the state could still punish people by sentencing them to involuntary servitude. So that's really what we say here. And when you think about the purpose of the 13th Amendment, one of the things it was trying to do was make sure that states could still punish people. Remember back in the 19th century, we didn't have the prison system that we have today, where people would spend long terms of these long sentences inside of a penitentiary and do these kinds of things. That kind of prison model had not become widespread yet. Instead, what you had was a lot of hard labor and stuff like that, it sort of was meant to make you into a better person by teaching you to work and all of these kinds of things. So this 13th Amendment was written at a time when that was what punishment really was. And so if you think about this language that we read today in terms of what people were thinking when they wrote it and when they voted on it, what they were trying to protect was the ability of states to say, you're convicted of this crime, and we're going to make sure that you have to do hard labor for a few years as punishment for this crime. That's really the fundamental of what we think the 13th Amendment means. And that's supported by language that the legislators were talking about at the time. It's supported by a couple of courts at the time who interpreted that language. And also, just maybe most fundamentally, it just makes sense about what that 13th Amendment means. It helps to put this in context of history as well, because it wasn't like we just skipped from slavery, chattel slavery, African slavery, to private prisons. There's a long history of government-sponsored subjugation, and the government using the criminal codes and other redlinings in there, which is not necessarily a criminal code, but using laws and legislation to make sure that certain groups of people don't have access to society like the rest of us do. And so you go from chattel slavery to the black codes and convict leasing. So this was a system that was set up immediately after the 13th Amendment was passed. And largely Southern Reconstruction states passed a bunch of laws that criminalized things like vagrancy, not having a job, hanging out in places that you shouldn't be, things that, had never been crimes before. And one particular thing about this is that they were not applying these laws equally, especially in the South. They were targeting African Americans, people who were former slaves. They were putting them, they were arresting them, convicting them, and then immediately leasing them back to people, to other private parties through the system called convict leasing, and making them perform some of the same labor that was happening under slavery. So it's a way for the Reconstruction South to maintain this free labor system that they had been relying on. Now you track that, which continued to happen through the early 20th century, and you get the Jim Crow and redlining laws, which is another way that the states and the federal government made it harder for people to access the political system, to what John talked about in the 1980s, where you have the war on drugs, which again was targeting disenfranchised groups. And I saw a question in chat that mentioned, is there a correlation between private prisons and a war on drugs? I think it's fair to say that the correlation is pretty tight. It's a question whether there's any causation between those two things, but certainly there's a correlation between the start of the war on drugs, the explosion of population that John mentioned, and the private prison industry growing with it. I think John mentioned the percentage of people who were incarcerated increased about 450% between 1980 and 2000. And the stats are something like 1,600% increase in people that were held in private prisons in that same time. So,
Robbie, if I can interject for just a moment. One thing about mass incarceration that we're certainly very cognizant of is mass incarceration falls most heavily on people of color, the poor, the homeless, people with mental illnesses, immigrants. We're quite aware of this circumstance. We're not bringing a race case, but we're quite aware of the fact that there is this huge disparate impact of the criminal justice system on the more at-risk parts of our population. Sorry, Robbie.
No, I think that history and that understanding, I think, is important to realizing how this system is just the latest incarnation of this government-sponsored private property interest in another person. So that's what the 13th Amendment argument is based around. The next claim that we make is due process in the 14th Amendment. Says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This says any state, but because of weird quirks of constitutional interpretation, it also applies to the federal government through the Fifth Amendment. But fundamentally, what this clause in the 14th Amendment is about is treating people fairly. That's what it comes down to. And there's a lot of case law out there about what exactly it means, and it's been well developed at this point. But when you're thinking about what does due process mean, it's about making sure that the government treats you fairly. And so here what we say is the government has a responsibility to make sure that it's not subjecting people to an increased risk of their constitutional rights being violated. And one of the things of that list, life, liberty, and property, courts have said is that liberty, when liberty interests are at stake, your freedom is at stake, they're going to pay particularly close attention. And here, that's what we have. And so what we say is when the state makes the decision to put somebody into a private facility, they are subjecting that person to an increased risk of all of the negative things that we talked about earlier on. The private prisons not being as safe, the likelihood that they're not going to have access to the same educational and rehabilitational facilities or programs in those private facilities. And John mentioned, and it's important to point out that at any given day or at any given facility, a person might have access to this or not that. And so we want to stay away from comparing, on June 1st of this year, this facility versus that facility. And that's not what the 14th Amendment largely requires. What we're saying is that transferring somebody to a private facility increases the risk that they are going to be subjected to these kinds of things that affect their liberty. And the cost plays into that because it's not the case that the government has to expend all of their money to make sure that your rights aren't violated or that you're not subject to increased risk of your rights being violated, but they can't do it unless doing so would cost them a significant amount more. There's a balancing test that has to do with a lot of different things. But what we found out is that private prisons don't actually save any money. So not only is it costing the government, not a substantial amount, it's actually costing them more money to increase the risk that this person is going to be, their liberty interests are going to be violated. So that's the argument for the procedural due process clause. We also talk about this line of cases that has to do with, it's called biased adjudicators or structural bias sometimes. And it has to do with, there were these systems throughout the United States occasionally where local judges or mayors would have a direct financial interest in the outcome of some cases. They would sit as a judge in, sort of traffic courts, misdemeanors, small things like that. And that money would go either directly to the city that the mayor controlled, or sometimes it would even go to like a fisc that their salary would come out of. And so this financial incentive in making sure that's, it was more likely that a person would get convicted, the Supreme Court has said that's not okay. And so when you think about how that applies in private prisons, the private prison at every single day when there's a prisoner and they're interacting with them, they get to make a lot of decisions about writing up disciplinary reports, infractions, what kind of, are you going to be allowed to go to this program today? Are you going to be allowed to finish the program that you had started somewhere else? All of these things that they do on a daily basis, which the corporation has an interest in making sure that that person stays in prison longer. So it's another way in which somebody is not treating fairly under the due process concern of the 14th Amendment.
If I can, kind of go from that point, Robbie, to a question that we get asked quite often. If only 10 to 11% of all prisoners nationally are in private facilities, and there are so many other larger issues in criminal justice that are in need of reform, why do we focus on this issue, privatization? And there are several reasons that I certainly would want to mention. The first one is the numbers can change dramatically and they can change quickly. So a state such as Arizona or Tennessee, its legislatures might consider bills to privatize its entire correction system. That happened. And those numbers in terms of the use of privatization can increase dramatically in a short period of time. So states like New Mexico and Montana, for example, are already placing approximately 40% of their prisoners in private prisons. Secondly, a small group of people can have a huge impact on this issue. Now, there are all kinds of other forms of advocacy, whether it's going to the legislatures or the county and city councils, whether it's writing letters, seeking other types of reform. And to the extent we can, we try to support those efforts by providing content. Most recently, for example, we've been in touch with student organizations at various universities who are going to their boards of trustees at their universities, asking them to divest from private prison corporations. We can provide supporting materials. But as lawyers, we have decided we can go to the courthouse, and that's where we can be most effective. And part of the reason for that is, number one, you got to start someplace. And we want to create lasting systemic change. So if you think of Brown versus Board of Education as a model, that's a circumstance where the NAACP's lawyers got a decision from the United States Supreme Court in 1954 that changed the law of the country from one where segregated public schools were constitutionally permitted to not being permitted. And if you think of that as a model, that's the kind of systemic reform we're seeking. A judgment from the federal court, hopefully the US Supreme Court, that prison privatization violates the Constitution, and an injunction that says don't do it any further. So that's where a small group of people has the potential for a large impact. But more fundamentally, we view this private profit incentive in criminal justice as a cancer in our legal system. And we think it's spreading. So if you think of a cancer patient who gets an early diagnosis of cancer, the response is not, well, I'll pay attention to this when it gets more serious. You pay attention to it now. And at this moment in our history, this industry does not have deep roots, and we're not so dependent on this industry that it is too big to fail. We've already been through that circumstance with our banking industry. So we think this is the time to do something about this. This industry is growing not just in the United States, it's growing globally. This industry is in the United Kingdom in particular, Australia, Brazil, France, Germany, it's spreading. And it's also diversifying into subsidiaries that provide for-profit parole, for-profit probation, fees and fines collection, ankle bracelets, bail bonds. And there was a story out of Casa Grande that's worth retelling. This was in 2012, and there was a circumstance where 3 police agencies, the Casa Grande Police, the Pinal County Sheriff, the Gila River Police Department, and officers from Corrections Corporation of America went on a drug raid at a public high school, a lockdown, locker search, bring in the drug sniffing dogs. And one of the reporters on the scene asked the chief of police, why are these employees from this private prison corporation out here on a police drug raid? And his response was, they are part of the law enforcement community. Like hell they are. Those are not publicly certified peace officers. And they are one of the largest employers in Pinal County. And the interpretation I have is they were out there to make sure their beds stay full. But what I found more concerning about that story was that the drug sniffing dogs were owned and trained by the private prison corporation, not the police agencies, which is an indication of where this is headed, where these corporations are starting to sell specialty services to police and prosecutors at the front end of law enforcement. So what we want to do is root out this profit incentive to put more people in the criminal justice system and to keep them there. So that's why we're picking this issue very precisely. It's something very concrete that we are proposing, and we are hopefully describing it in a way that people can understand what we're doing and make a decision whether to get behind it. So again, we're seeking to influence the system. We think that the presence of this profit incentive threatens the very integrity, if not the legitimacy, of our criminal justice system. With that, Robbie, would you want to talk about some of the organizations that support abolition?
I think we did, but I'm happy to go back to it because I think,
or I guess I should say, what are some of the ways in which they are supporting abolition?
Sure. Yeah.
Strategy.
Yeah. I think, depending on the organization and depending on how involved you are, as John said, this is what we can do as lawyers. And there's a lot of other ways to help move this issue forward. We talked about resolutions, and Paul started the conversation by mentioning the resolution that I don't know if it was the entire Methodist Church or some portion of the church had put together, and the Arizona Faith Network. It's not just churches that have done this. The American Bar Association has a resolution that says that this is actually a bit of an older resolution, and it says that municipalities and people that are considering using private prisons should stop. They're called for a moratorium until some of these things could be worked out. Of course, they ignored the ABA and did it anyways, but there's the NAACP, the Japanese American CDL. So a lot of groups, faith-based, civic-based, have joined together and said, our organization stands against the principles that private prisons stand for. It's something that is easy for individuals to do. Go to think about organizations that you belong to, that you could belong to, get involved, get a movement going. Because one of the things that I found very interesting as I've been doing this private prison work is that it's a rare issue. That when you tell people about it, if they haven't heard of it before, almost universally, people understand that it's bad. There's just something fundamentally wrong about tying profit to how long someone stays in prison. There's a very narrow group of people that usually profit from the system that think that it's right. There's also some people who approach it from a sort of libertarian perspective and think that, private corporations can do everything better than the government, that don't necessarily agree. But this is a wide coalition of people that understand that it's wrong, and they approach it from different viewpoints. So that's one thing. Another thing is thinking about where money is. Some of the largest banks in the country have decided that they're not going to continue loaning money to private prison corporations. They're still involved in somewhat intricate financial dealings, more or less. But you can look at organizations that you're involved with and ask them to pull money out of anything that would be investing money into private prisons. There's large divestment movements around campuses across the country, local organizations. Another thing to do is network and talk to people. One thing that we like to do at Abolish Private Prisons is do these kinds of things where we get to meet and talk to people, explain the issues. I like to think about it as the sort of the original things going viral. This year, we've learned about that concept of R0 in terms of how quickly things spread. If you can get private prisons to be R3, right, which is that every time that one person learns about it, that person tells 3 other people, and then each of those people tells 3 other people, now 9 people know, that kind of thing can blossom very quickly. And I think it's helpful to just talk to people and say, have you heard about private prisons? This is what they do. This is how they affect people negatively. That kind of groundswell of sort of grassroots thinking about it can be very effective. And we've talked to state legislators, and one thing about state legislators is that they're much more accessible than federal legislators. Your local state representative, it can be much easier to get either face-to-face time or a phone call with their staff. And many state legislators either don't know about it or it's not one of their core issues. If you can convince them that their constituency cares about it as a core issue, that can be a way that you can enact change at a state level. And as John mentioned, most people in private prisons are held held by the states, not by the federal government. So it's a way that you can very directly influence people, is to, through that networking and then using that network to talk to state legislators. Some organizations have agreed at some point to work with us and write an amicus brief. And an amicus brief is, it means sort of friend of the court, and it's what a group can do that's not directly involved in a lawsuit, but they can tell the court, hey, here's something that you should think about when you're deciding this case. So churches sometimes write amicus briefs to tell the court, here's how the church is thinking about this issue. Law professors sometimes write them to say, you know, here's how law professors are thinking about this issue. It's a way for the court to get an outside perspective on the issue that's in front of it, even from people who are not directly involved as parties. Of course, money is always welcome, whether that's directly to abolish private prisons or other groups that are doing work in this space. And if you have legal skills, we are always looking for people to help us do research, or even if it's not legal skills, you know, financial research. The organization Abolish Private Prisons is extremely small. John and I are the only full-time staff members. We like when people volunteer and use their particular expertise to help us out. So those are some of the ways that we can, you know, that people can get involved if they feel passionately about the issue.
I know you wanted to build in time for question and answer, Paul. Is this a good time to segue into that?
This is perfect. Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we still have several questions to go. So let me just go through these questions. One of the questions, and I think you've spoken a little bit about it, is there empirical evidence that Arizona inmates are treated better in state versus private prisons?
Not that I'm aware of. And of course, not having those comparative reports affect that. What we have is anecdotal information. I think the most important thing I would say is what I said at the very outset. Our case is not a comparative case where we're saying public prisons are better than private prisons. What we're saying is private prisons should not exist at all under the United States Constitution. And there shouldn't be this profit incentive to keep mass incarceration going.
I have a slightly, you know, John's right. The case is not about comparison. We definitely don't want to say that public prisons are good, because everybody knows they're not. There's a couple little wrinkles to that. One is that although I don't think either of us is aware of any empirical data about Arizona, there are some academic studies people are treated in other states. Although, you know, we talked about it starting in 1980, the growth of private prisons is still a relatively new phenomenon when it comes to time for, you know, experts, academics, people who have the analytical skill to do the kind of research and data gathering to go out and make these comparisons. However, there are a few sophisticated studies that states that people spend approximately 10% longer in private facilities, largely down to the fact that in that state, more people in private prison were receiving infractions, disciplinary infractions, which meant that they spent more time there. There was also a study that showed that the people that were in private facilities, I think it was in Wisconsin or Minnesota, that they didn't have access to kinds of rehabilitative programs. So not that we're aware of in Arizona. In other states, it looks like there is some gathering data that suggests that people really are treated worse in other places. And I do think that we can say that private prisons are worse for the people that are in there, without saying that's what our case relies on. And that doesn't mean that public prisons are good. It just means that these kinds of negative things, getting reduced to a line on someone's balance sheet, hurts someone's dignity. You know, we've talked to people that when they have to imagine that the fact that they don't have access to this program is because some private individual wants to make money off of them, that hurts their dignity. And I think that does make private prisons worse.
There's one study in particular I don't want to forget. So in August of 2016, toward the end of the Obama administration, the Department of Justice released a study by the Office of Inspector General on its view of private contractors under contract with the federal government for private prison operation. It was a 70-page report, and generally what it concluded was that the facilities had serious deficiencies, including much more violence and incident reporting, and it resulted in the decision at the level of the federal government to stop contracting with private prisons through the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Now, that doesn't affect the states, but it would have affected the federal government. What happened was we had an election 3 months later, and a new administration came in and said, no, we're reversing that, and we're going to continue to contract with private prisons, and we're going to use them actually a lot more. Now, I don't want to be political about that, but what that says is two things. Number one, there's one federal study comparing public and private. But more importantly, for our purposes, that's how quickly decisions of that sort can change, which is why we've gone to the courthouse. We want lasting change.
Thank you. I have a lot more questions here. This next question, I hope I'm reading it correctly and getting the intent correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. Isn't it true that private prisons are serving a much needed rehabilitation function?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the person would be who asked the question is referring to. Clearly, the contracts require that private prisons provide services. Whether they are or not is a separate question. And the people I talk to on the inside provide different information from one facility to another, from one day to another. And so the answer is, yeah, they provide some services as they're required to, as they're paid to. But are they doing it better than the public's? And is it necessary? This would be the more fundamental question. Is it necessary that it be provided inside a prison? So, you know, what we're hoping to accomplish through our litigation through the courthouse is a declaratory judgment and an injunction. But what we would hope is part of the response of governmental leaders to such a court decision is, instead of looking at ways to build more public prisons, why don't we start treating substance abuse as a public health issue and figuring out ways to provide rehabilitation without keeping people's lives entangled for years and years and years in the criminal justice system. So yeah, there's rehabilitation services provided as in public and as in community corrections and probation and parole requirements. But how do you compare them?
Thank you. The next question is there a way to give prisons a reward for people who leave prison with skills and do not return? In other words, providing an incentive to prisons to treat people correctly and educate them.
That's you want to take that one, Rob?
Sure. Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question, I think, because I think that there's clearly, the answer is, I think it's clear that you can design prisons to accomplish different things. I think if you look how prisons operate in different countries, Northern Europe, for example, is much more focused on rehabilitation. Question, can you import it to different places? Maybe. There's a private facility that's in, I think it's Australia, it might be New Zealand, but they've designed it, instead of paying at a per diem rate, they've designed it to reward successful rehabilitation. They get punished for recidivism. You can design these contracts in a lot of different ways. It's just that the way that they're designed in the United States, and definitely in Arizona, does not do that. They're designed to pay in this per diem guaranteed rate that has all of the wrong incentives. So I think it's clear that you can think about different ways to do it a lot better than we're doing it here.
And the fundamental point that Rob made is this. That is a rhetorical question, because that is not the prison system that exists.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Could you please speak to the dynamics of prison labor, both in the prison daily operations as well as in for-profit private sector corporations?
Part of our complaint is that when prisoners are forced, either directly or through duress, to do labor inside the private prisons, such as maintenance work, what that's doing is that's coming from the per diem payment from the state to the private prison operator. And by using the prison labor to provide some of those services, it allows the corporation to avoid hiring employees to do that work, and thereby lower their cost and increase the profits to the corporation shareholders, which is different than having somebody do work inside of a public prison where you're reducing the taxpayer liability. So, but in terms of, are the jobs the same? Are the jobs rehabilitative? Do they allow people to earn money so they have it when they get out? One of the common complaints that I hear from people inside the walls is they're getting paid cents, you know, like 8 cents, 10 cents, 40 cents for an hour, a week, 2 weeks worth of work. So they're hardly able to build any kind of a savings account for when they get released from that.
Yeah, I think for some strange particular legal reasons, we have really not focused on forced, coerced labor. There are organizations that are doing a lot of that work. In particular with immigration detainees, there's a few cases, one out of Colorado that's very interesting that has to do with Fair Labor Standards Act. There's people that are really looking into this much more closely than we are. Labor in prisons is very fraught. It looks different in public and private, and the sort of dynamics of who's making money off of it is different. But this is one place where I think John's point about not saying that public prisons are a lot better is very relevant, because people in public prisons are subject to a lot of those same, very manipulative, and even if you're not, forced to do labor, by, at gunpoint or something, you hear people who, they're not getting enough food at the or at, as part of their cafeteria. So they feel like they have to do labor to buy things at the commissary at inflated prices when they're not making any money. So labor in prisons is an extremely, delicate and terrible thing. But it's one place that we haven't focused on fleshing out the difference between public and private facilities.
Thank you. Next question. How do district attorneys impact the private prison system? Is this something the voters should pay attention to?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm assuming the person is referring to the elected Arizona Attorney General or the elected county attorneys. The federal prosecutors are appointed, at least the U.S. attorney. I can't think of county attorneys that have a public record on how they feel about private prisons or whether they've pushed them. They clearly have had a huge impact on the number of people we put in prisons generally, not just in terms of individual cases, but in terms of policies they've pushed at the legislature, which, by the way, also includes diverting public funds to their offices.
Yeah, I think that the way to think about how the prosecutors are involved is largely their discretion about how to charge people and the kinds of, deals that people make, to supercharge people with a bunch of offenses to make it very attractive to plead guilty to a lesser offense that includes mandatory minimum jail, prison time, or something like that. There is a very interesting study that just came out within the last few months about how discretion in sentencing and prosecution affects the amount of people that are in prisons. And that study suggested that when states used private prisons, when there was leniency involved or when there was discretion involved, people were getting sentenced to more days. So it was one explanatory factor of how the existence of private prisons could lead to more people in prison. And so it's very subtle and complicated how, when discretion is involved, how the choices that public actors make can negatively affect somebody and make them end up in prison, or make them end up in prison for longer.
Thank you. Interesting. Last question. If or when we do close the private prisons, do we have facilities for those prisoners?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are several different ways to go about talking about it. There are some states that have used private prisons that have passed laws to back out of using private prisons or to ban them completely. So California is a good example of a state that was using private prisons in Arizona and in California and in Oklahoma. And then it passed AB 32, a law in 2019 that backs California out of the private prison system. And so it wasn't just passed in a vacuum. California was already starting to reduce its prison population generally, and therefore its need for the private prison cells. And how that's going to go will, of course, be of interest. The same thing happened in Nevada in 2019. There have been places like the Colorado, I think it was a Denver City Council, that decided to back out of the use of private vendors for, I think it was halfway houses. So it's going to be of interest to see how some other places that did use private vendors fare when they decide to back out of those relationships, and what can be learned from it. The second thing is, we now have this COVID pandemic situation, which has already forced corrections officials in all different parts of the country to look at, given that prisons can become incubators for spreading this virus, what can we do about reducing that risk, such as by reducing our prison populations, by looking at the people who appear to present no or very little risk to the public by being released from prisons. Well, that's the kind of exercise that we could start undertaking generally, and not just because of COVID, in advance of any decision on whether private prisons will be abolished by the Supreme Court. So there are different ways to go about it. The one thing I would hope comes from reform efforts is that we start very seriously looking at alternatives to incarceration, and more importantly, that we look at changing our policies so we don't funnel so many people into the system in the very first instance.
Yeah, just to add on very quick, I think that those are the most important points. I would just say that, one thing that's possible is the facilities are the hard part, and they exist. So one sort of slope out of this is to let the public run the facilities that are currently owned and operated by the private vendors. But that's a very small technical detail, and John's certainly right to focus on the larger issue of decarceration in general.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for your presentations today. It's been fascinating. It's been a ton of good information. Here's the contact information again for John and Robert and abolishprivateprisons.org. Robbie put together a real nice discussion of additional steps that we can take to help abolish or getting rid of private prisons. In addition, just to briefly expand, just a reminder, there's a vote coming up in a couple of months, both state and federal elections, and so governments are going to look different. State and federal governments are going to look different next year than they look today. So there could be real opportunities there to make go in a different direction on private prisons. And John and Robert are in court trying to make get a court to declare these things private prisons are unconstitutional. So different ways to approach it. So thank you all for being with us. And John, Robert, thank you so much for your time this evening. Wonderful.
Thank you all very much for this opportunity. And if the viewers do nothing else, I would encourage people to at least sign up for our newsletter so that they can hear what we're up to.
All right. Thank you very much. Go in peace. Have a wonderful evening.